Sometimes real life is stranger than fiction. This is a reality trip with Ben Pharma Jr.
Hello, everybody. This is Ben Fama Jr. Thank you for joining me today. This is Reality Trip, and I got my special guest host, Miss Mesa Fama. Hello.
Hello.
How are you today?
I'm doing fine.
All right, doing good. And we are broadcasting live right now at facebook.com/Ben Fama Jr. So if you got any comments, any questions, anything you want to bring up on the show, ask us and we'll answer it live. And if you're watching us on the rebroadcast, you can check us out here on Facebook or on YouTube and on audio on iTunes and Stitcher. And we're doing a special broadcast today. It's pretty early in the morning for us usually here, but we got a special guest host today coming from Germany. So that's why we're here doing it live early in the morning. So let's get to it. I want to get to this topic because obviously I stirred up a shitstorm talking about this recently. And
yeah, that's one way to put it.
So I want to talk about naturopathy, or what we like to call alternative medicine, and the harms and the consequences of it. Now, I live in Sedona, Arizona. We live in Sedona, Arizona, where it is prevalent out here. There's a lot of people that believe in alternative medicine. They'll fight about alternative medicine, but I don't think people truly understand the problems when it comes to naturopathy and alternative medicine. And our next guest is more than qualified to talk about this, and I'm super excited to bring her on. So let's get straight to it right now. So my next guest is a former naturopathic doctor. She writes about her experiences in the alternative medicine world at her blog, naturopathicdiaries.com. So please help me welcome to the show, Miss Britt Hermes. Britt, how are you doing today?
Hi, good morning. I'm doing fine, thank you.
So, Britt, first off, before we get started, what is naturopathy? How would you describe that?
Well, how would I describe it, or how is it commonly described?
Yeah, for
some both.
Yeah, for some people who don't know, what that is. I mean, could you describe what that is and what alternative medicine might be?
Naturopathy is an umbrella term that essentially encompasses all things alternative to medicine. So this includes some of the practices that most people are likely to be familiar with, such as acupuncture or using supplements, perhaps because they are deficient in certain nutrients, or even using supplements in lieu of prescription drugs. This includes herbal medicines. It includes other esoteric fields of alternative medicine, such as homeopathy. What makes naturopathy unique, though, is that it's a very eclectic field. So you can find practitioners doing all sorts of these familiar alternatives, but also practicing some pretty obscure things like iridology, which is the practice of looking at the iris to diagnose and make treatment recommendations. You'll also find a lot of energy therapies, so Reiki, or what's called the laying on of hands, which is very similar to faith healing. I think it's this sort of broad nature of naturopathy is what makes it so confusing and hard to pin down and dangerous ultimately.
So obviously you have a background. Tell me how you ended up getting into this field. Like what makes you qualified to talk about this subject?
Well, I'm qualified to talk about it because I worked as a licensed naturopath for about 3 years. In order to become licensed as one of these alternative practitioners, I went to an accredited naturopathic school. So I attended Bastyr University. I graduated from Bastyr, which is outside of Seattle, Washington, in 2011. I passed the profession's licensing exam. Now, for those listening and for those who are drawn to alternative medicine, I want to say something here that I think is really important. Naturopaths are not board certified in naturopathy. This exam that we take after we graduate is a licensing exam, and it tests us on alternative medicine knowledge. So I took this test, I passed it, I was licensed in Washington State, and then I practiced in Tucson, Arizona. But I got there after having a bad experience as a teenager with a medical doctor. Essentially, I was diagnosed with an autoinflammatory skin disorder called psoriasis, which can be pretty disfiguring. And I had a pretty severe case of psoriasis as a teenager. So at the age of 16, I went to my dermatologist. I was asking for help, and my experience was that I felt brushed off by the doctor. I felt like he didn't have time for me. I felt like he couldn't answer questions that I had about why me, why is this happening? Is there anything else I can do besides take these prescription medications? And after this terrible experience, I felt like I needed a more emotional and a sympathetic ear. So instead of turning to a different dermatologist, I instead started to pursue alternative therapies and to look for alternative practitioners who could provide me with the support that I needed, which was really not medical care, but rather just someone to listen to me.
Do you think that, and I don't want to like cut my husband off, but you touched upon something that has really stood out to me in regards to medicine in general and why people turn to alternative medicine. Do you think that plays a part, the emotional component?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. Women in general, and this is pretty, it's a pretty general statement, but women in general are more drawn to alternatives to medicine. The naturopathic field itself as a profession attracts far more women than men. And I think, at least from my personal experience, it has something to do with not the medical therapies necessarily that are being offered, but the context around that. So the warmth and the sensitivity, sympathy, empathy, and the willingness to just listen to that person's story and sort of to be witness to their medical experiences.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like what we were just talking about the other day when you contacted your doctor and they seemed very just cold and nonchalant.
Oh, yes.
You know what I mean? And I remember watching a documentary one time with Richard Dawkins in it, and he talked to a natural healer or natural practitioner or whatever. Anyways, and it sounded like it was the same thing. They take more time with their patients. They're much more caring. They spend a little bit more time emotionally, where it seems like doctors are cut off. So why do you think that's more appealing in the sense when it comes to why people actually to do it? I mean, is it enough to just say, oh, because of the emotional? Is there any other aspects that would cause people to want to be drawn to alternative medicine?
Absolutely. Many patients who are drawn to naturopathic therapies are patients who have difficult to treat or perhaps difficult to diagnose conditions. So the field tends to attract patients who have perhaps chronic fatigue issues of feeling tired all the time, perhaps have pain, problems managing that pain, finding the source of this pain. Practitioners in naturopathy tend to see a lot of patients with symptoms that are very difficult to pin down. So maybe rashes that come and go, gastrointestinal symptoms that come and go, headaches for no reason, insomnia. So these are very sort of difficult complaints to troubleshoot with a medical doctor and do take some time. And I think the vast majority of patients who find themselves in a naturopath's office have had an experience like what I've had, where they're asking questions. They want to actually understand a little bit more about the physiology of their body, the pathophysiology of the disease or condition that they're dealing with. And 10 minutes with the medical doctor in a cold room just isn't going to provide that patient with the education that he or she is looking for. So it's really easy at that point to feel like you have been sort of shunned from the medical profession, especially if you're a patient who has a chronic condition, right, and has a history of perhaps been going to the doctor for the last 18 months, dealing with insurance companies, trying to find someone, that's covered by your plan that fits this criteria, that criteria, where you don't have to wait 6 weeks to get in for an appointment. All of these types of frustrations that come with just navigating the medical field. What's appealing about naturopathy, besides the sort of the sympathetic environment that it provides, is it seems to be far more streamlined than the conventional medical system, in that most practitioners, especially in Arizona where you guys are at, don't bill insurance. It's a flat fee based on time, out of pocket. Most people can get in with a naturopath, within a week, perhaps 2 at the very most. So relatively, this seems faster. And it seems to be, at least when you are first getting into naturopathy, it seems to be far more transparent than the conventional medical system. Of course, it's far more complicated, but when you are tired and sick and frustrated and you just want someone to listen to you, those aspects of naturopathy are quite appealing.
Gotcha. So let's walk through your experience a little bit. Let's talk about your experience as a naturopath and what led you out of it.
The quick and dirty story of leaving naturopathy happened in Tucson, Arizona it was in the spring of 2014. I was working at what we described as an integrative natural medical center in Tucson. My boss, who also owned the clinic, saw cancer patients. He saw other types of patients as well, but he mostly made his bread and butter seeing cancer patients. And I was assisting him in that practice. In addition to taking care of my own patients, I was helping him administer some of these herbal cancer substances to his patients. One of the substances that we were giving was a drug called Ukraine, like the country. And this was a very expensive drug that patients were paying out of pocket for thousands of dollars, and they had to pay for the drug up front because it was being shipped from overseas. So one day the drug just didn't arrive, and the patients who had, of course, paid for thousands of dollars for this medication and who were waiting on this drug to arrive were concerned and asking me questions. I asked my boss what was going on. He made the comment that perhaps the drug had been confiscated by the FDA, which set off alarm bells in my head. I didn't quite understand why this medication that we were giving to cancer patients would be confiscated by the FDA. Well, I went home, I Googled the drug name and Googled FDA, started to look up information why Ukraine would be intercepted this way. And it turns out that it is not approved by the FDA to treat cancer or any other disease, which is a really big deal. This means that the importation and the administration of Ukraine to patients for any reason, for any medical reason, is a federal crime. And I had, at least in my mind, been part of that, because under his medical orders, I had helped give this drug to patients, which was administered by injecting it directly into their veins. So this was a pretty brutal and devastating wake-up call for me. It led to me, of course, quitting the practice, securing legal representation, making a formal complaint against my boss with the Naturopathic board in Arizona. I also submitted a complaint and went and spoke with the Attorney General. It also, however, led me to look at the profession as a whole. So after I was sort of able to deal with the grief of suddenly not having a job and coming to terms with what I had done in conjunction with my boss, I then started to critically look at the field on a broader basis and realized fairly quickly that this is not just a rogue practitioner who decided to take matters into his own hand. This is actually pretty indicative of the naturopathic profession in general. And I started to find examples of this type of unethical and illegal behavior across the country.
Wow. And I remember you talking about this and saying that once you came out of this, you had a hard time finding a job anywhere in the medical community. Can you explain why it was so hard for you to find work anywhere else?
Naturopathic practitioners are licensed in some states and in some cases as medical providers by legislation that has allowed them to cheat the system. I think this is really essential. Naturopathic practitioners do not attend medical school. They aren't required to take a medical entrance exam like the GRE in order to obtain entrance into medical school. Many times these schools don't even have GPA requirements. They go through an education and training program that is unique and specific to naturopathy. So there's a major focus on these alternative esoteric therapies rather than conventional medical treatments. So there's virtually no training in emergency medicine protocols or exposure to how to deal with acute medical problems. And as I said, once you graduate, you're allowed to take a licensing exam. There's no required residency. So whereas medical doctors are required to do at least 2 to 3 years for family medicine residency, for example, of just hands-on intensive training in medicine and how to apply medicine and practice critical thinking skills, naturopaths are allowed to graduate and go straight into practice, which is totally absurd. So there is a misunderstanding by the wider public, and I think many legislators, that naturopaths are equivalent to medical doctors or to primary care providers. But in fact, they function and operate in their own little land. So that being said, when I wanted to step out of the naturopathic profession and look for a job in the legitimate medical field, nobody would accept my credentials. Nobody. So naturopaths are not qualified to do a medical residency. So they couldn't go and do a medical residency in a hospital with other medical doctors, for example. I wasn't qualified to work as a nurse. I wasn't qualified to work in a phlebotomy clinic or any sort of healthcare management position. I couldn't even get my foot into the door with any HR department. And I was coming from a perspective of, yes, I'm a naturopath. However, I don't agree with these principles of naturopathy. I don't agree with my profession. I think my profession is unethical. And I was trying to get hired in places as someone who would work as an advocate for conventional medicine to help bring patients who were exploring alternatives or perhaps doing dangerous therapies, to bring them back to conventional medicine and to help keep them in the medical system. And I couldn't even get hired at this as this type of patient liaison even.
Wow.
Yeah, because people always debate me all the time and say, well, this is actual doctors. They're accredited in or not accredited, but they're part of university. I hear this argument all the time, and unfortunately, I'm not qualified to debate the thing. But I wanted to be clear about why people think it's legitimate, why they think, and what do you think could be done to help, like with all these courses in colleges and licensing and stuff? What do you think can be done to kind of combat some of that stuff? Do you think briefly?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. So we need to work at a legislative level for sure to help place laws that will keep patients safe and to ideally help roll back legislation that has provided the public with the illusion that naturopaths are trained as medical doctors. The naturopathic profession uses these terms of credibility like accreditation, right? It's exactly what you said. We attend accredited schools, licensed doctors, physicians. These are key words to the public that mean something very specific to a patient who's going out and looking for healthcare, for medical care. And so I've long called for restrictions around the use of these titles like doctor and physician. I believe placing restrictions on who and when naturopaths can treat patients would be really helpful. I don't believe that naturopaths are qualified to treat children or adolescents under the age of 18, for example. I don't believe naturopaths are qualified or legitimate practitioners for highly vulnerable patients, so patients with cancer or other terminal illnesses that seem to be more susceptible to bullshit and to anything that will provide them with hope, essentially. And I think as a community, the science and skeptic community, more outreach to our legislators so they understand at the government level that the term accredited isn't actually a mark of legitimacy. Yes, naturopathic schools are accredited, but it's accredited by a board made up of naturopaths and other alternative practitioners who are sympathetic to naturopathy. So I believe there's some acupuncturists and chiropractors who sit on the board, for example. And to show you like just how convoluted it is, this board that accredits naturopathic schools was set up by the former president of Bastyr University, the naturopathic school where I attended. So this was a very well thought out plan, I would say, by the naturopathic profession as a whole to start to reach these so-called hallmarks of legitimacy in order to further their own profession. So for political gain and ultimately for financial gain, because let's face it, as naturopaths become more recognized on a wider level, on a federal level, the profession will financially benefit.
I want to get into a little bit about what the harms and problems of this, because a lot of times people debate us and they're just like, well, I've been doing this for years and I don't see what the problem is. Why don't you just leave us alone? Before we get into that, if there's anyone I see some people leaving some comments, whatever, but if you guys have any questions, if you'd like to ask, feel free to do that and we'll bring it up on the screen and we'll ask. So again, what is the problems and the harms? Some people, I know there's probably a spectrum here, but can you give us some examples of how this actually creates harm in society?
Harm in society. Yeah, well, I will first just talk about personal harms for the patients, I think, who are pursuing these therapies. The big harm, which I think is pretty easy for most people to see, is that pursuing alternative therapies can lead to patients using alternative therapies instead of conventional care. In this scenario, the alternative therapies can be outright dangerous. So, for example, some pretty classic naturopathic therapies include intravenous injections of baking soda, intravenous injections of hydrogen peroxide, rectal enemas with coffee, super, super high doses of nutrients. I just heard from a patient the other day who was injected with so much iron that she suffered iron poisoning. So I think that's pretty clear. And this happens far more often than the naturopathic profession and the medical profession realize, because many times these patients don't come forward. The other harm that it can directly cause to patients is that these alternative therapies can actually interact pretty easily and pretty readily with conventional medicine. So in a cancer treatment context, it's actually not clear if intravenous vitamin C, for example, which is a common naturopathic treatment, actually does nothing to the patient receiving chemo or hinders chemo treatment. So, of course, you have these really potentially dangerous nutrient drug interactions that can happen. On top of all of this, there's the time and the money that the patient is investing. On a societal level, I think when you start to have patients dabbling with alternative medicine, perhaps for conditions that aren't so dangerous, like the ones I was mentioning, like cancer and autoimmune diseases and whatnot, rather they're using alternative therapies for conditions that will get better on their own, like perhaps headaches or, I don't know, a bout of stress that is also creating some sort of physical problems like gastrointestinal distress. Then you start to develop a subpopulation of patients who had some pretty strong confirmation bias, some pretty strong experiences that they believe alternative medicine worked for them. Therefore, alternative medicine can work for you. Therefore, alternative medicine can work for cancer. Mm-hmm. It's actually a pretty easy, slippery slope to fall down. I've experienced it myself as a patient, as a teenager, using conventional medicine alongside these so-called alternative therapies. I attributed my improvement to the natural remedies rather than the steroid creams that I was using. And this quickly snowballed into this perception that I should at the very least be adding on alternative medicine to every conventional treatment that I do. Next thing I know, I am choosing a graduate school in order to become a naturopathic practitioner. And several years after that, I'm actually in a scenario where I am recommending to patients on a regular basis these non-evidence-based, non-science-based therapies in lieu of real medicine.
Yeah, that's one of the arguments I hear all the time too. Was there's a balance between both.
Yes, there always has to be a balance.
Every time I was debating this with people, they're just like, there's a balance between both and or. I'm going to read a comment real quick from Sandy Craven. She's actually a local pharmacist here in Sedona, which she was on this message board with us battling a lot of these people. Let me see if I can bring this up real quick. Okay, so the comment is, I have seen over the years Sedonans using, what is that, colloidal silver?
Colloidal silver.
Colloidal silver.
Yes.
This is a very dangerous therapy. Yeah.
It is ozone and medical marijuana to treat serious cancers, of course, with ultimate failure.
Hard to believe. So, yeah. So what you were talking about this just a little bit just now with the balance of the both. How do we debunk this? There's a balance. I've heard this saying, how I don't remember exactly who said it, but something about you can't have a cow pie and an apple pie because one distorts the other. Anyways, maybe you can explain a little bit better than I can.
So the saying has been popularized by a science writer over at the blog Science-Based Medicine named Scott Guevara, and he's a pharmacist himself. And he has said over and over that mixing cow pie with apple pie doesn't make the apple pie better. And he's used this as a metaphor to sort of introduce the conversation about why this idea of integrative medicine, having both balanced, is a good idea or is perhaps beneficial for the patient. I think what patients commonly mean when they talk about having both available is the aspects of medicine that have been hijacked or redefined as alternative. So good nutrition, eating well, moving your body and exercising, making sure you get enough sleep, doing check-ins with yourself of how stressed am I? Am I doing the right sort of self-care and taking time for myself? This is not alternative medicine. This is just regular, good old-fashioned self-care. And I think patients tend to confuse these things, rightfully so, because naturopaths and other alternative practitioners have, as I said, misappropriated these terms and these therapies as something that is unique to naturopathy and something that medical doctors ignore. This idea that medical doctors don't care what you're eating, or medical doctors don't, have the time or the willingness to speak with you about perhaps a multivitamin or something that could be beneficial for you is total nonsense. Naturopathy is nothing but alternatives to medicine. So all of these just like general wellness stuff is just plain old good fashioned medicine.
Yeah, I agree. Let's take a couple more questions. Actually, we got some questions coming in here. Sandy Craven says, any general thought about the use of essential oils for anything that have become so popular?
So essential oils are super popular. I get this question a lot, and they're used in naturopathy in a variety of medicinal ways. A common way that I used to talk about essential oils is to actually put some of these oils into a neti pot. Do you know what a neti pot is?
I do. I know what a neti pot is.
It's I've never heard of that. Neti pot.
Yeah, it's
for some people may not know what it is. You want to explain what it is? I have no idea what it is.
It's like a little vessel that looks like a magic lamp, like Aladdin would come out of, and you put some salty water in it, and you drain your sinuses with it. So you can hold it and pour water in one nostril, and if you tilt your head at the right angle, the water and snot and gunk will come out the other.
Yeah, it's kind of gross.
It is kind of gross.
Wow.
It is kind of gross. It's a common practice from Ayurvedic medicine, which is an alternative medicine branch popular in India. So essential oils, I believe, do have some chemical properties that can be antibacterial. But we don't, as far as I understand, have enough evidence to fully support the use of them in as a pure medical therapy. And we have to be very careful because essential oils can be very toxic. So we know that some essential oils applied topically can actually cause damage and be irritating to the skin, and perhaps even cause cell damage or DNA damage, potentiate cancer cell growth in some contexts. Taken orally, this can be very toxic, especially for young children, and could even poison them. So I think it's safe to err on the side of caution. If you want to spritz some essential oils around your house and use them as a way to relax and to perhaps take care of yourself, fine. But using them as a medical therapy, I wouldn't do it quite yet.
Gotcha. Let's read a couple more comments here. We got Tommy Barr. He says, we're facing a similar challenge here in Canada. Over the past few years, naturopaths have begun to be self-regulated in some of our provinces. So it seems like this is a worldwide problem right now.
Absolutely.
When I talk to people a lot of the times, I try to tell people, maybe briefly you can say, I tell people alternative medicine is not medicine. There's no such thing as alternative medicine. Why is that?
Because by definition, it's an alternative to medicine. And medicine has this really great system of science and evaluating therapies. And so if something has been critically and repeatedly evaluated by the scientific community, it usually and almost always gets integrated into the regular medical practice. Things exist on the fringe. Things exist as alternatives to medicine because they've either failed to pass these credibility tests or because they haven't been studied yet.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you. I'm glad you cleared that up for me. So let's ask a couple more questions here. And these are some of the questions or concerns that people have brought up to my attention. One of the first ones was when I challenged people about alternative medicine. They said the only reason why it hasn't been proven is there's not enough money for research and there's not enough money to be made in the alternative medicine field. How would you address that?
Yeah, again, alternative medicine and many therapies that are common in alternative medicine have been studied. So a lot of pharmaceuticals actually derive from natural products, and we use them today because perhaps we had an inkling of their historical use or their traditional use, or because smart scientists were able to isolate these compounds. So there is plenty of research money available. Medicine, especially exploring new therapies, is a hot topic. It's actually the reverse. It's that we're spending millions, if not billions of dollars on looking at these alternative therapies over and over and over again when the science already says that it doesn't work. So in fact, we're sort of shooting ourselves in the foot, in my opinion, in some of these cases, like continuing to study homeopathy, for example, or even continuing to study some herbs by just producing massive amounts of research that says again and again and again, this therapy is not a viable therapy for the conventional practice of medicine.
Excellent. So I'm going to bring up our, if you have kids, cover your ears. I'm bringing up two bad words for everybody in the entire world. Big Pharma. How do you address, okay, so I hear this all the time, like every argument I ever have with anyone, they're always, Big Pharma this, Big Pharma's trying to cover this, Big Pharma. Okay, so first off, let's talk about what do people mean briefly about Big Pharma, and then what are some of the concerns you hear? I hear stuff like they're trying to cover it up, there's so much money in Big Pharma, there's obviously problems that are in Big Pharma, so maybe can we clear up some of these misconceptions about Big Pharma? What do we mean by Big Pharma first off?
I believe people mean that just, the worldwide pharmaceutical industry, which includes, from what I've seen from these conspiracy theorists, every medical doctor and every scientist who studies anything related to health and disease.
Okay, and then so what about some of the actual concerns, though? I mean, some people brought up some legitimate concerns about people dying. There's, people dying of a prescription opioid epidemic. How do we kind of separate people from understanding what they perceive to be Big Pharma and then the actual problems that we need to address with it?
There certainly are problems with the pharmaceutical industry. There have been some pretty atrocious historical examples of some severe ethical failings, for example, of studies where patients were not adequately informed of the treatment, or perhaps studies were allowed to continue far longer than they should have because of health and safety concerns for the patients involved in the trial. So I don't want to pretend like there's no room for improvement in terms of health and medical research. And and there's more examples on the ones that I'm just sort of bringing up here. However, the medical system in general is pretty darn good at self-correction. And so it certainly has failed. It has certainly failed more than once, but the vast majority of people in the health and medical industry are there because they want to help patients. They're not there because they're making money. This idea of drug kickbacks does not exist. I believe there was some aspect of this decades and decades ago, but again, it was brought to light in terms of ethical problems and not in the best interest of patients. And measures are taken repeatedly to sort of fix these ethical transgressions and to make the practice and the science safer for everybody involved. What I find interesting is that oftentimes big pharma is spoken about without acknowledging the fact that big supplements also exist. So a lot of supplement companies are functioning just like pharmaceutical companies. When I was in practice as a naturopath, I had representatives from supplement companies visiting me with free food, free gifts, free lunch, all the time. And we frequently spoke with these supplement representatives about, discounted prices for the clinic and perhaps how to make more money for the clinic. And if we switch our product lines over to this supplement company, how financially beneficial it would be for the practitioners in our clinic. Now, this doesn't exist in the same way as it does. This is actually fairly unique to the naturopathic world because medical doctors aren't allowed to sell drugs out of their practice, but naturopaths are allowed to sell supplements and the products that they are therapeutically recommending directly out of their office to patients at a profit. We sold everything at a 100% markup. We made a ton of money off of everything that we recommended. So if I'm sitting with you, in the office and I'm saying, oh, you have an iron deficiency, I'm then walking you out into my waiting room, picking up my iron supplement off of the shelf and then selling that to you at a markup. So there's a whole host of ethical problems that exist within and that are unique to the naturopathic community and exist around the supplement industry.
Excellent. Briefly, I want to ask you another question, and then I got one more question. We'll try to wrap this up. One of the arguments I get all the time is, well, it's been around for thousands of years, and it's worked for me. How would you briefly address that?
Yeah, just because something has been around for a long time doesn't mean it's good. So this is sort of a classic critical thinking fallacy. We can talk about other things that have been around for a long time, like sexism or racism, or
right, those are
just
great.
Just because the theory or the practice has been around forever doesn't mean that it's valid. Also, just because a lot of people use it doesn't mean it's valid. There are a lot of things that are popular that are nonsensical or perhaps dangerous. I think this is where sort of medicine differs significantly from naturopathy. Again, just getting back to the science, even after drugs are approved or even after medical practices have been around for 10, 20, 30 years, they are continued to be studied. Data is continued to be brought in to evaluate the therapy to see if it's still working for the patients who are, seeking this therapy, making sure that it's still safe. Whereas the naturopathic profession seems to just take everything in and then keep it. They don't tend to do any self-correction or reevaluating of what they thought was working.
Excellent. And we'll take one more final question here. This is from, Stephen Ingram, I believe. So it says, Britt, can you talk about how to begin to change people's rigid beliefs, ideology around alternative medicine?
Yeah, so the $100 million question. I believe it's starting with understanding why that person has opted to pursue naturopathic or alternative medicine in the first place. Until we can understand why that person has turned to something outside of conventional medicine, we can't really start to address what that patient may need in order to bring him or her back to conventional medicine. So, and this will vary, of course, person to person. It could be fear of death, fear of undergoing a very scary treatment with known terrible side effects like chemotherapy. This is a common thing that we see. It could be feeling like they need to be heard and perhaps need someone to play a role as more of their partner in health, in which case someone like a health psychologist or a psychiatrist would be a really good option for this patient. And it could be that the patient actually just needs to be able to feel like he or she can have an open conversation with their medical doctor and to be honest about what is realistic and what is not realistic in terms of the medical treatment. So many patients are hesitant to tell their doctor, I'm actually having a really hard time taking this drug twice a day as prescribed, or I'm having a really hard time, continuing to take this because it makes me feel really bad after I take it. And these lines of communication tend to break down, and then that's when the patient starts to look for something beyond regular medical care. So I think first just creating an open environment, which sounds really like warm and fuzzy, I know. But first is creating an open environment where you can have this sort of conversation in a safe way where the patient isn't going to feel threatened or judged is the very, very first step. And then once you understand what that patient needs, then you can actually reach out to him or her to provide it and to make sure that the patient understands that it is accessible within a medical environment.
Now, obviously, you speaking out, actually, I do want to wrap up with this. You speaking out, obviously, which is brave, and thank you for doing it. Obviously, sometimes it'll attract a lot of attention, a lot of enemies. Right now, you're battling somebody right now. Unfortunately, there's someone who brought a lawsuit or attempting to bring a lawsuit, I believe. Do you want to talk a little bit about what we're talking about and why that's a problem?
Right. So I am actually being sued in Germany. So I live in Germany. I live in northern Germany where I am completing a PhD program right now. And I'm being sued by an American naturopath who is in Arizona, actually in your neck of the woods. Her name is Colleen Huber, and she treats cancer patients using alternatives to medicine. So some of the therapies that she uses in her practice are intravenous baking soda, intravenous vitamin C. She recommends a very strict diet of no sugar for her patients. And she is a fairly outspoken critic of conventional medical therapies. So she has said and written things on her website that she believes chemotherapy and radiation, for example, will weaken patients and strengthen cancer. I wrote a blog post about her in December 2016, which seemed to really offend her. In this blog post, I criticized these alternative practices, which are not based in any evidence, and in some cases really have no scientific reality behind it, no scientific basis behind it. And I also heavily criticized some of the so-called cancer research that she conducts in her clinic on her patients, where she collects data and has run an analysis which she has then used to make very bold claims, such as, most of her patients go into remission using her therapies and following her diet. In my mind, this was a great opportunity to have a scientific discussion around these alternative therapies, around how research should be conducted. I have some pretty serious concerns about the methods that she used and the ethics of her research. Colleen Huber, unfortunately, instead of engaging me in this scientific discussion and opening the lines of communication with me, opted to sue me in Germany, where the libel laws, which is what I'm being sued for, are more plaintiff-friendly than they are in the United States.
Wow.
Gotcha. Do you know what's the basis of her argument? What is she claiming?
Defamation.
Okay.
So defamation basically means that, she alleges that I have willfully and intentionally lied and that these lies have directly hurt her practice.
Gotcha. So if people want to find out more about this or to help support you and what you're doing, or just finding out more about you and your amazing blog and all the stuff you're doing, where can I send the audience to?
Right. So I have written about all of my experience as a naturopath, leaving the profession, and then what I do today and this lawsuit at hand on my blog at naturopathicdiaries.com. The last several posts have to do specifically with the lawsuit. So if anybody is interested in this and wants to know more about why I'm fighting it, which is simple, I'm fighting it because I haven't done anything wrong. My opinions are supported by free speech laws in both Germany and the United States. However, any of the listeners, watchers can visit my website and get all of the nitty-gritty details about it.
Great,
Awesome.
Beautiful. And we got a bunch of people in the comments thanking you. So thank you for all the beautiful hard work you're doing. Any final thoughts, babe?
No, I was just going to say thank you as well. And please keep up the good work and let us know whatever we can do to support you. If we need to bring you back on, later on, so to give an update on things, I would love to keep, talking to you about this. This is super important. So keep fighting the good fight. You have a ton of support, at least from us. So.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, guys, that's our show for today. Make sure you guys like and subscribe, and make sure you share this podcast because, like I said, this is a lot of valuable information. So help get the word out there because we're up against the David Avocado Wolves of the world and the Alex Jones of the world, and we need to get the good people out there getting the messages out there. So if you're on our YouTube, make sure you like and subscribe, and then on the audio, make sure you guys do the same thing. So anyways, leave some comment suggestions below, and we will see you guys next week. Thank you guys so much.
You've been listening to Reality Trip with Ben Pharma Jr. Check out more great content by visiting benpharmajr.com.